Yeah, it's for. So just get on the record. So I do believe in God. I do believe in the magic of the supernatural. The reason I don't bring it up in the debates with Bernie is because I'm not an expert in that. What I am an expert is in refuting evolution. I'm not an expert in defending Genesis. I leave that to others. There are very few people who are experts in refuting evolution, and I decided to become one of them. Bernie likes to do debates of evolution versus Christianity. I like to do debates about evolution on whether or not it is a valid science. When you ask the question of which is a better theory of the origin of life, and you say that you like evolution better, you have to ask, that begs the question, well, what makes evolution such a great theory? And that is the question that I attempted to answer. We talked about that. So in the book, I reviewed many scientific articles. I tried to find out what was the real evidence for evolution. And I couldn't come up with it. I reviewed about 300 journals and from the scientific literature. In my book, I have 400 references, all of them scientific, and I tried to find what is the real science that supports evolution, and I couldn't find it. So I submitted a manuscript to an evolutionary biologist at UC Berkeley, another one in Oregon State, and I asked them, what am I missing? Because I can't find the evidence. And what they did is they sent me 100 other references, and I read those, and I still couldn't find it. And that's the basis for my research project. So Jerry, in the book, Why Evolution is True, he said, how do we know the creationists are wrong when they say natural selection can make small changes but powerless to make big ones? We know of no other natural process that can build a complex adaptation. The most commonly suggested alternative takes us in the realm of supernatural. Bernie Daler echoes this. But again, this begs the question, how do we know natural selection or evolution is a natural process? Is evolution the equivalent of the supernatural? So my goal is to be aware of proper scientific interpretation, reveal what the scientific literature can and cannot accomplish, show why evolution is not a scientific theory and is impossible, and recognize how literature claiming evolution makes unsupported conclusions. So the definition of evolution is descent with modification from a common ancestor. The mechanism is, first, there's a random mutation of DNA of an individual or a few individuals in the natural selection to increase those individuals in a population. What does descent with modification mean? It means an ancient creature long ago, over many generations, had offspring or descendants change into different organisms. And these descendants grew more body parts and developed into populations which could not reproduce with each other. Two types of evolution. A common ancestor can undergo microevolution, in which it evolves into a same or similar species, such as a common dog or a wolf can evolve into several different breeds of dogs, or some common horse-like creature can evolve into a horse and a donkey. There is plenty of evidence for this. Then there's macroevolution. A common ancestor is believed to undergo descent with modification and become many very different species, such as man and chimp. There is no evidence for this. I looked for it. I couldn't find it. The empirical limits of evolution. Through my review of 400 references, I found there's a clear line between what evolution can do and what it cannot do. There is no ability to evolve increased physiologic complexity, and I'll explain these terms later, and no ability to evolve physiologic reproductive isolation. No exceptions to that rule. Increased physiologic complexity involved in macroevolution is adding new and different interacting parts that enhance or maintain a function, such as you add an iris to an eye and add more blood clotting factors. Humans have about 22 clotting factors. Other creatures have 17 or fewer. And there is no one has ever documented the ability to evolve more clotting factors. Microevolution involves simply changing, involves no increase in body parts. It's simply changing what you already have, changes in color, size, shape, carbon metabolism. Horizontal gene transfer is a form of microevolution. That's where genes transfer from one bacterium to another, or it's only involved in the bacteria and plant world, where for example, in penicillin resistance, a gene from one resistant bacterium is transferred to another. There is no increase in complexity. There may be an increase in complexity of that individual, but not in the population. It's a pre-existing gene. Also, that gene in horizontal gene transfer is not incorporated with the rest of the organism. It is a free, independent gene. So, just to drive home the difference, microevolution, same complexity, just slightly different. No new parts. Macro, an increase in the number of different interacting parts. You add a spleen. You add more proteins to a flagellum. Never been shown. Microevolution examples, penicillin resistance. So one bacterium will deposit a gene into another. No increased parts within the population. It may be in that individual. And that gene is also not incorporated. The product of that gene also is not incorporated in the parts of the bacterium. Darwin's finches, ironically, are a form of microevolution. He described two different finches on different islands, the Galapagos Islands, one with the broad beak, one with the narrow beak. That's an example of micro. The only difference is the earlier gene expression of this product called bone morphogenic protein number 4. No new parts, only a change of existing parts. Macro example, flagellum, which is the tail of a cell. In bacteria, it has relatively few protein parts. In animal cells, it has many more. No one has ever seen a flagellum grow even one more protein part. Physiologic reproductive isolation is a product of a phenomenon of the alleged microevolution. That's where two species absolutely cannot reproduce with each other. You had a sperm and an egg in a test tube, and they will not merge and form a viable offspring. Frogs and snakes, man and chimp, no matter what you do, they cannot mate to produce a fertile offspring. Non-physiologic reproductive isolation, such as in microevolution, two species do not normally reproduce, but they could, such as lions. There is such a thing as a liger. Lions and tigers normally don't mate, but they can, and occasionally their offspring can be fertile. Horses and donkeys produce mules. They're slightly different species. They can produce viable offspring, but they don't normally. That would be an example of non-physiologic reproductive isolation, which is part of microevolution. The documentation of the existence of physiologic reproductive isolation. Believe it or not, a Soviet biologist in 1927 did artificial insemination of human sperm in several chimpanzees, and nothing happened. At Cornell University Medical Center, an investigator tried in vitro fertilization of human sperm and several different animals, monkeys, baboons, and about 10 others, and no cross-fertilization could occur. Most fish do external fertilization. Fish deposit their sperm and eggs in a river, and they come in contact, but there's no cross-fertilization. So physiologic reproductive isolation is ubiquitous, yet evolution has no evidence to explain it. So just to drive home what it is diagrammatically, so it is believed that some ancestral species evolved into chimp and man. Chimp and man, we know, cannot mate with each other. The phenomenon of one species being able to evolve into two species which cannot mate with each other there is no evidence for. That's Richard Nixon, by the way. The significance of physiologic reproductive isolation. Evolution claims there is common ancestry among reproductively isolated populations, such as humans and chimps. But empiric evidence says only members of population that can reproduce with each other have a common ancestor. Evolutionists just make up a criteria for what is defined as a common ancestor. Empirically, we know that if you have a common ancestor, you have to be members of populations members of a population can reproduce with each other. There is no evidence to the contrary. So just questions about the mechanics of micro versus macroevolution, not about the theory, just about what I explained. All right, is evolution a scientific theory? So these are my references for what science and logic. These are standard secular textbooks that I use for my criteria for science and logic. Different types of theories and beliefs. There are scientific beliefs. You can't just call any belief a science. There has to be a criteria for it. And evolutionists and scientific philosophers almost universally agree that it has to be it has to be testable, falsifiable, and there has to be empiric evidence. There are also historical beliefs, things that you can't prove in a laboratory. These beliefs can be true, such as the Holocaust or what you did at your last birthday party. They may be true, but you can't recreate these events. Now, a misconception that I've run into is people often confuse artifacts, whether it's fossils or a B-29 bomber from Korea or World War II, as empirical evidence of something that has occurred. These are circumstantial evidence. Empirical evidence would be you would actually have to be there. Circumstantial evidence needs some sort of inference provided. So historical data, historical events can only be inferred, and artifacts are just circumstantial evidence. You can do recreations of the Civil War, but you can't recreate it. You can't reproduce it. Science has to be testable. A test of a theory has to predict the phenomenon. Falsifiable, theoretical ability to prove it wrong, and empirical evidence, anything that can be observed or measured is amenable to scientific investigations. Explanations that cannot be based on empirical evidence are not part of science. I agree with all of this. Theory of evolution cannot be based on empirical evidence. Examples of the testability in microbiology. I have an undergraduate degree in that. You have a theory where Staph aureus causes a skin boil. You inoculate staph underneath the skin versus saline at control, and you observe the empirical evidence that the boil is caused by the staph only. Not testable. Now, things that aren't testable can be true, like historical facts. The life of Julius Caesar, the fact that you ate a pizza last week is true, but you can't do a test to get empirical evidence about it. So these beliefs are based on human documentation, memory, and you can't gain empirical evidence for it. You just have to trust the people that what they said is true. But it's not science. Falsifiability. Things that can be tested and potentially could be proven wrong, such as the law of gravity, states that objects of different mass fall at the same rate. Now, that could be falsifiable if you show objects of a different mass fall at different rates. Not science. Potentially could not prove wrong. Now, if the law of gravity stated that objects of different mass fall at the same or different rate, then no matter what the outcome, your theory is supported. So this is testable, but you can't potentially prove it wrong. This is not a science. You have to be able to have an outcome, a potential outcome that can be shown wrong to have it as a viable science. Evolution is not science. There's no empirical evidence. It can't be tested or falsified since it takes billions of years. It can't be inferred from observations. Evolution arguments claiming it's science are universally distorted because the part of descent with modification is ignored. I didn't define evolution. This is the National Academy of Science, National Science Foundation's definition of evolution. The falsifiability has been distorted. Famous biologist in the 1940s said evolution would be falsifiable if you find a skeleton of a modern rabbit instead of an ancestral rabbit from the Precambrian era, which is over 1 billion years ago. Now, the distortion is evolution is presented as simply the existence of different species at different times. The descent with modification is ignored. Recall, evolution claims that the ancestral rabbit or fossil rabbit modified into the modern rabbit. Descent with modification is the definition of evolution. So a true falsification would be if the descendants of an ancestral rabbit did not modify into the modern rabbit. You can't falsify it because you can't follow descendants over billions of years. The testability of evolution is distorted. Nick Matsky, who collaborated with me on my book, biologist at Berkeley, he says you can test a theory by looking for outcomes that it predicts. Evolution predicts the fossil record and transitional species. Again, descent with modification is ignored in the outcomes. It's only asserted. Analogously, you could say aliens predicting periodically mating with earthlings also can predict the fossil record and transitional species. But in both cases, neither aliens nor descent with modification is witnessed. So a true test would be you follow descendants of the fossil record modifying into transitional species. And you can't test this because it allegedly occurred over billions of years. I'm going to try to drive home this testability clarification. Karl Popper, famous scientific philosopher, confirming evidence should not count except when it is a genuine result of a test of the theory. So a true test would be you can test a theory by looking for outcomes that it predicts and causes, or at least has a strong association with. Looking for outcomes alone, such as the fossil record or pseudogenes or DNA, is not a test, since evolution is about how the outcome got there. Again, descent with modification, which is a definition of evolution, is ignored in these tests. This commits the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, where an outcome is shown, but no relation to the theory or intervention is established. I named my book Evolution by Affirming the Consequent because after reading authors' conclusions to their scientific papers, this is the number one fallacy that is committed in evolution literature. To drive home the point, in conventional sciences, such as in medicine, you have a prior state, such as high cholesterol population with high cholesterol. You have an intervention, such as taking a statin drug, and you measure an outcome, such as low cholesterol, all empiric evidence. Evolution, by contrast, you have an ancestral primate. It allegedly undergoes descent with modification, and you have an outcome of man and chimp. The difference is, in conventional sciences, you see or measure the cholesterol, the prior state. You see or measure the low cholesterol. And the intervention, taking the pill, you see or measure. By contrast, evolution, you see the ancient primate, you see the man and chimp, but the descent with modification is nowhere to be found. So saying evolution, the difference between evolution and conventional tests, it's like saying you're testing a drug, you think a drug causes a low cholesterol, but no one ever sees the drug being given. But evolution predicts many outcomes, therefore it has to be true. The number of positive outcomes, quote unquote, is not enough to support a theory. You must show the outcome is caused by or at least strongly associated with the theory. The evolution intervention, descent with modification, is never shown. So there's not even an association attempted. By contrast, the geocentric universe theory, where it was believed that the sun revolved around the earth, also predicts sun locations. The ancient Greeks devised mathematical formulas where they could predict where the sun would be based on the theory that the sun revolved around the earth. They were able to predict many outcomes, but they were wrong. There was a theory called preformation, in which the early fetus was thought to look like a fully developed adult. And with that theory, you would predict when the creature is born, it would be fully developed. And in fact, that's what happens. Also, the theory of spontaneous generation. You leave meat out for a few weeks, maggots will grow. It was believed that the maggots just spontaneously came from nowhere, when we later found out it was just flies dropping their eggs on there. That you can have multiple outcomes that would be predicted. You leave out several pieces of meat, and all of them will grow maggots. Those are outcomes that support your theory. So a theory can predict many outcomes and be wrong. Inference. Dawkins, in his book, I shall show the irrefragable power of inference that evolution is fact. So inductive inference is reasoning from specific examples, circumstantial evidence, to a general principle. And in evolution, the examples that they infer from, they show the fossil record in DNA, and from that, they falsely infer what they think is a logical conclusion of evolution. The problem is, to infer something, the inference has to be supported by examples of empiric evidence. So you observe, this example is in all the logic textbooks on secular campuses. The classic example they give is if you observe 2 white swans, you can infer all swans are white. But if you see 400 white swans, then the inference that all swans are white is even greater supported. If you don't see any white swans, then there's no basis for your inference that swans are white. Trends can sometimes be inferred. If you have a graph of vapor pressure versus temperature, and you see a trend, sometimes you can infer what's going to happen with the greater temperature, sometimes you can't. Inference requires examples, and the more analogous the example, the stronger the inference. In my field, occasionally you get infections. And you can infer, and this is common practice, this is standard medical practice, that after an infection, after orthopedic surgery, Staphylococcus aureus is the most common organism. So doctors, when we see a red wound, we automatically give an anti-staph antibiotic, even without doing any testing. Now, there's no test of it. Now, we may not have done the test, but other doctors who published journal articles prior to us did do tests, and they showed that there's a high chance that staph is the most common infecting organism. So we may not have done the direct observation, but other people did, and this is an analogous situation. Now, conversely, our inference that an orthopedic infection is due to staph is not due to papers that show what the organism is in sexually transmitted disease. It is not an analogous example. Evolutionists have different ways of phrasing inference. Inference. Regarding the origin of species, they say, what else could it be? And is the simplest explanation. Analogously, you could say, what's the simplest explanation for the cause of death of a raccoon on the street? Again, inferred or simple answers are based on prior examples from human experience. You may not have seen that particular raccoon hit by a car, but you know from your own experience or experience of others who've told you that that's the most likely answer, even though you didn't see it. Now, Bernie talks about how he has these outcomes and he makes the inference of evolution as the most likely cause. But again, to make an inference, it has to be supported by prior examples. Maybe not what you saw, but what other people saw. There has to be empiric evidence somewhere. The distortion of inference is that there's many examples of evolution, such as fossils and DNA similarity. Therefore, evolution must be true. Now, the distortion is that the purported examples aren't real. There's a little circular reasoning. They say the fossils and DNA are evolution examples because they were derived by evolution. There has to be, the fossil and DNA similarity was not seen to be caused by descent with modification from a common ancestor. Again, that's not my definition of evolution. That is the National Science Foundation definition. And Bernie agrees with that definition. So the other distortion is that it is claimed that microevolution, although and I agree that microevolution occurs, that you can infer with time, over 1 billion years, you can get macroevolution. Now, the distortion is that these are not analogous examples, and there's no trend. Micro and macroevolution are qualitatively different. Microevolution has no increase in complexity and no development of physiologic reproductive isolation. Macroevolution, you do have an increase in complexity, and there is physiologic reproductive isolation. Microevolution is not a small increased number of parts. It is no increased number of parts. What would be a real example of inference? A real example, if you've documented the descendants of one species become 10 other species which have increased complexity and physiologic reproductive isolation, then you could probably infer evolution for all species. That would be real inference, but no one has documented that. There are no examples upon which to infer evolution. Mechanical questions about scientific validity. Is evolution possible? No, because life requires intermolecular fit. You look in every page of a biochemistry book and you'll see examples of where one molecule fits another molecule fits another. Examples are hormones and their receptors, the blood clotting proteins, and gene regulators. They have to fit by both of their three-dimensional geometric shape and their electrical charges. Evolution is impossible because evolving life's intercollecting molecules is like making pieces of a puzzle randomly and having them all fit perfectly. A review of genetics. Man has about 3.2 billion nucleotides, and nucleotides are adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine. And these genes can be hundreds of nucleotides long, which code for specific amino acids and proteins. And the arrangement of these nucleotides is analogous to a computer code. The arrangement of the different nucleotides will produce a protein of a specific shape and charge. If you change one of these, the shape and charge will be different in most cases. Complementary coevolution is a concept that is the evolution's requirement that multiple genes evolve simultaneously or nearly simultaneously so their products can interact, and it would be statistically impossible. So if you have a hormone like insulin and its receptor, they're on two different chromosomes, in fact. They have to be made so that they fit each other. These arrangements have to be arranged so that they make the appropriate shape here. And these need to be arranged in the appropriate order so it gets a corresponding shape. That is what makes it unbelievable to me. Now, there are tens of thousands of these reactions in life. So I'll go through one. Bernie doesn't like my statistics, but Vern Bissell has a degree in statistics and math, and he looked it over. Insulin has 51 amino acids. It's on top. It must fit a 731 amino acid alpha receptor, which must fit a 620 amino acid beta receptor. These receptors are in the cell membrane, so the hormone, insulin, floats through the blood and binds upon cells in different parts of your body and then initiates an intracellular reaction. They all fit each other. Could an ancestral alpha receptor change just two amino acids to fit insulin and the beta receptor? Evolution doctrine says that everything had an ancestor. Even the alpha receptor of the insulin, for the insulin molecule. So there was a time when the alpha receptor and the hormone did not fit. So it's a 731 amino acid protein. So what are the odds of it just changing two amino acids to get from some ancestor to the modern protein? And you do the math, you have to factor in there's 4 nucleotides. The gene size of the alpha receptor is 2,193 nucleotides. There's some what's called redundancy of the genetic code. And you do the math, and there's a worksheet over there in case you're interested. And depending on how you figure it, you can get a 1.98 times 10 to the minus 23rd chance. Or if you count for a certain number of mutations and a certain number of generations, you can get an even lower number. These are the odds of just getting 2 amino acid mutations to make a functioning insulin alpha receptor. So evolving genes for intermolecular fit is statistically impossible. Now, I presented this example to my critics. This is from Nicholas Matsky, the biologist at Berkeley. And he countered with this paper that which title was just like my theory. The title of it was Evolution of the Hormone Receptor Complexity by Molecular Exploitation in the Journal of Science. So I told him that it can't happen, And Dr. Matsky sent me this article saying that it can happen. So I read the article in detail. So in this article, the scientists made some ancestral receptor, like what I did in my example, an ancestral receptor. And it was for one hormone called a mineralocorticoid, which regulates regulates the ions such as sodium and so forth in your body. And they changed it by 2 amino acids out of a 984 amino acid protein to give affinity for a different hormone, glucocorticoid, which is involved in stress reaction and inflammation in the body. So they had an ancestral receptor like I did in my example, and they changed it 2 amino acids. And they were able to get those, change those 2 amino acids to get it fit one hormone to a different hormone. But it was a poor study design. It did not simulate evolution. There was no random mutation. These mutations were selective by the scientists involved. They did selective mutations of 2 amino acids restricted only to the binding site of the protein. So over 900 amino acids were shielded from what is supposed to happen is natural random mutation. So it was a selective mutation, and there was no natural selection. The study was done in cultured cells. It was in vitro, where there was no need for animal survival. So you could have many different types of mutations, and you can get a positive outcome in many cases because they don't even know if the hormone functioned. It was in vitro in a cell. It wasn't in the body. So it wasn't a random mutation. It was selected, and and no natural selection because it was in cultured cells in vitro and not in the animal, which is real life. So this did not simulate evolution. This paper is very typical of evolution literature. You'll read a summary or an abstract of the study. They'll say a doctor did thus and so, and therefore molecular evolution can occur. But when you pick it apart, you see all the flaws they make. They redefine what evolution is, and they redefine success, and they put it through unrealistic circumstances. And the other thing they had was that the study depended on the coincidental presence of the second hormone. The second hormone was already there. So in other words, they stacked the deck. They had all the pieces of the puzzle already there, and they selectively changed 2 little pieces, and they showed that one piece could fit the other, but they don't even know that it can work. Now, another area where complementary coevolution comes into play is in physiologic reproductive isolation. Sperm and egg receptors, there's receptors on sperms and eggs, and they need to fit each other. These receptors are species specific. A receptor of a human sperm will not match up with the receptor of a gerbil sperm. That's one of the blocks to interspecies mating. So you have a sperm and an egg. The receptors are made by the genes in the DNA. The genes are the A, G, C's, and T's, which are arranged specifically. The specific arrangements of these nucleotides have to be such that this matches this. If there's small deviations in the nucleotide arrangement, they will not fit, and you have extinction. I don't think it's possible. Evolution requires mutations to make new species. That's what they say. You get a new species from mutation. So if you have a mutation in the egg receptor, it will no longer fit the sperm receptor. And since there are nearly infinite number of mutations possible, a new sperm-egg receptor match is unlikely. So if there's mutation in egg, there has to be some mutation in some specific spot here such that they fit. If they don't, it's extinct. Diagrammatically, evolutionists believe that there's some common ancestor that can mutate into different species. Sperm mutates, won't match the egg. Egg mutates, it won't match the sperm. Not only that, if for some reason you do get them to mate, you do get them to match, the corresponding male or female needs to have the mutation in the same reproductive period. It doesn't do any good if it mutates, the egg mutates 100 years after the sperm, and it has to be within the same geographic area. If an egg mutated across the world, it wouldn't do any good for that sperm that mutated. So it's added complexities that make it unbelievable. So complementary coevolution explains the boundary between micro and macroevolution, since new biochemical and organ systems require statistically impossible biochemical arrangements of DNA nucleotides of multiple genes to yield fitting gene products. Questions about the mechanics of that only. Is there genetic evidence for chimp-man common ancestry? No. DNA similarity claims are poor science. It's claimed, and the genetic measurements of common ancestry are not validated. Any genetic similarity among different species is simply because in biology we learn phenotype is a result of genotype. How it looks, the phenotype, is a reflection of what the genes are. That is empirically confirmed. Evolutionists expand on this, and they think genotype is a reflection of evolutionary origin, whereas empiric evidence says that it's simply a reflection of phenotype is simply a reflection of genotype, and all you can say is genotype determines what the creature looks like. It's often quoted that now the DNA similarity of unrelated humans, depending on how you measurement, is 99.9 or 99.5% similar of unrelated humans. It was claimed that man and chimp DNA is 98.76% similar. The implication is that since man and chimp are so similar in their DNA, it wouldn't take much mutation in order to evolve man and chimp from a similar common ancestor. But when you read how this paper was done, it's not true. The paper was very disingenuous. What they did, if you look in the methods section, they mechanically fragmented the DNA into 300 to 600 base pair nucleotide fragments. And they matched up the fragments. So the organization of the DNA, not even the genes, was considered. So it's like having two books and claiming that 98% of the words or syllables are similar. Now, of course, arrangement means everything. So it was a very disingenuous study. Other papers, Journal of Nature, they found we could assign the human alleles as ancestral or derived in 80% of cases, which is much less than the 98%. Journal of Gene, this isn't Genesis, this is the Journal of Gene. Only half of 384 known chimp proteins have a human counterpart. Sounds like much less than 98%. The Y chromosome was thought to be only 1.9% difference by the fragmentation method. But in Nature Letters, the journal called Nature Letters, when they actually did direct sequencing and took into account the order in the genes, there was over a 30% difference. Does DNA similarity indicate evolutionary relationship? DNA similarity is not a verified measure of interspecies relationship. It's only verified for intra-species relationship. An example of a DNA verification relationship tool is variable number tandem repeats, where there's repeated segments of DNA arranged like in a barcode fashion, and the closer the pattern you have, the closer the relationship. This is used in paternity suits. This is verified by human testimony. And there's other methods that are used for determining the origin of certain strains of bacteria. Now, again, does DNA similarity indicate evolutionary relationship? The problem with evolution, quote, science, is that they use these measurement tools, but they're not validated. In conventional sciences, every tool we use is validated against some gold standard. For example, you want to make a new kind of scale. You validate the accuracy of the scale by weighing multiple things of known mass. When MRIs first came to play in the 1980s, we have these images. We didn't know what they meant. So we put pathology, known pathology from surgery and cadaver samples into an MRI, and we saw that these images correlated with these findings from surgery or from pathology. And actually, in my orthopedic journal, there was a new test that came out, a test where you can measure your blood level. Now, after knee surgery, you have knee replacement, there's frequently a lot of blood loss involved, or blood transfusions. And so we routinely collect patients' blood every day to find out what their blood count is. And then it's directly measured. Well, someone came out, they published an article in the orthopedic journal just a few months ago where they developed this little device you can just clip on your finger, and it just sits there, and it can measure the hemoglobin level or the blood count by that way. Now, how do you know it's accurate? They know it's accurate because they compared it to the direct blood test method, the gold standard. So evolution uses these tests, but these tests aren't validated. Analogy, it's like using an ultrasound to determine the age of an adult when it's only been validated to determine the age of a fetus. You can't do it. All right, fair question. If there's no evidence for evolution, then what does the literature show? Well, it's very clear. After reading about 100 papers, I was able to classify them into two groups. One is they either just show microevolution, and these are multi-generational studies. That's where they do an experiment with living creatures, and they follow it generation after generation. The other, which is the more common, or they're simply descriptions of the biologic diversity among nature, of several species, and the evolution is simply asserted. These are single-generation studies. And I'll give you examples. It was claimed that E. coli, which is a small bacterium, evolved into a new species out of the journal of bacteria. You read, I think this was cited in Dawkins' book, and you read the abstract of the paper, and that's what the author said. He said E. coli evolved into a new species. But when you read the fine print, all he did is it changed the E. coli from a glucose metabolizing bacterium into a citrate metabolizing. And there was only one enzyme was modified by 2-point mutations. No increase in complexity. Example 2. It's claimed that multicellular creatures can evolve from single-cell creatures in Journal of Nature Communications. And all they did was they showed that an algae grew a thicker cell wall, causing it to clump. There was nothing was new. It was just the same thing clumped together. Nothing different either. It was also claimed that evolution of reproductive isolation can occur in Drosophila, fruit flies. And this is a classic article that's cited all over the place. And Dr. Dobzhansky, he was able, over Drosophila it only takes 2 weeks to multiply. He had 2 different strains of a single species of Drosophila, and he was able to breed them and become reproductive isolated. But then you read that the author admits it was only behavioral and not physiologic reproductive isolation. Now, the second type of literature is where the author simply describes the diversity in nature and the descent with modification is merely asserted. Example 1. It's claimed that the flagellum can evolve more protein parts in the journal Nature Reviews. But all they did was compare the flagellum parts and numbers and DNA sequences among various species. It was a single-generation study, and they just asserted that the flagellum can evolve more parts. And all they did was compare, this animal has 50 parts, this animal has 30, therefore evolution. It was also claimed in Ken Miller's book that Bernie referenced that bacteria can evolve multi-step enzymatic pathways. In this example, there's the chemical called 2,4-dinitrotoluene, which is a man-made pollutant, Journal of Bacteriology. And all the author did was they found 2 different strains of bacteria, one that could degrade it and one that couldn't. But he never showed that one evolved from the other. They were both living at the same time, a single-generation study that happened to have different potential of degrading. No evolution was shown. It was only asserted. Third example. Jerry Coyne, who in his book Why Evolution is True, claimed that he could show that the eye could evolve. And all he did was describe that in flatworms they have a light-sensitive pigment, limpets, which is a type of sea creature, had an eye cup. Ragworms Abalones had a lens, and mammals had eye muscles. And all he did was compare the different complexities of nature and simply asserted or assumed the evolution. But evolution is descent with modification from a common ancestor. All he did is describing the diversity of nature. This is the most common fallacy in evolution literature. Bernie likes to talk about pseudogenes. They allegedly have no function. They're thought to be broken remnants of previously functioning genes from a common ancestor. There is a human pseudogene. Now, rats can make vitamin C because they have this enzyme called GULO. And humans have a stretch of DNA that looks similar to that enzyme that rats have, which is why humans cannot make vitamin C and why we need to ingest it. But when you read the original article out of Japan, all the authors showed was that there were small differences. It was a very disingenuous study. The gene for making vitamin C has what are called 12 different exons, which are segments of it. All their humans have are 5 of those. He showed that there was a lot of similarity of 5 of the 12 exons. So humans don't even have 7 parts of it. What they do in these studies, they take databases. There's people do the genetic measurements. They do the genetic, look at the DNA of different species, and they put it into a computer program. And all they do is they press some buttons and they see where the DNA is similar among various species. That's how they make the conclusion. They found that there are stretches of DNA in humans that are similar to 5/12 of the enzyme in rats that makes vitamin C. So it was a disingenuous study. But not only that, it doesn't show descent. Even if it were solely identical, the DNA similarity, as I said before, is not a validated method for determining relationship between species, only within species. There is no gold standard to confirm that what you're showing is accurate. So, the distortions of evolution. There's tests and falsification without using descent with modification. There's inferences without examples. And there are genetic evolutionary claims based on poor methodology and lack of gold standard. And the literature shows microevolution or simply describes the diversity in nature with the macroevolution asserted. So that begs the question, what would be scientific evidence for evolution? Well, you follow descendants of a common ancestor over generations become physiologically different. That is, they grow more parts and become physiologically isolated, which is the definition of evolution. Well, the criticism I get, well, that's not fair because it would take 1 billion years. My counter-criticism is, therefore, it can't be tested and is not a science. Conclusion. Evolution is an intellectually dishonest theory since it's taught as a science but doesn't qualify. It is a faith-based belief. Now, Bernie, he likes to contrast Genesis with evolution, and he says he assumes that evolution is a natural process and it is scientifically backed. But when you look at it, evolution is also a faith-based process. There is no evidence for it. Everything is based on distortion, and I've showed plenty of evidence. I've looked through 400 references, consulted with 2 experienced evolutionary biologists. I don't think I'm missing anything. And it is a faith-based theory because it depends upon the unseeable, unmeasurable, untestable, unfalsifiable, supernatural force of billions of years of descent with modification, and it's impossible. And that's all.